Greetings, lovely souls. Today's video revolves around the themes of love, connection, and the intricate elements that nurture flourishing relationships. For an extended period, Mrs. Wright had relinquished hope for a miracle. The prospect of starting anew, altering circumstances, or seeking forgiveness from those she may have unintentionally hurt was a notion she had relinquished. The elderly lady had led a rich life and harbored no remorse for the years that had slipped by. Within those years, she had both given and received love. There had been moments of grief and aspirations left unfulfilled, yet they were balanced by profound happiness. Mrs. Wright's marital journey began early, born to simple laborer parents. A serendipitous encounter introduced her to Isaac, a student from an intellectual lineage. Instantaneously, their hearts intertwined, leading to a swift marriage. As Isaac engrossed himself in writing, often lost in thought, Mrs. Wright capably tended to him, earning his deep gratitude and the endearing moniker of his guardian angel. Isaac's literary career ascended, his books embraced by readers and published prolifically. The family soon acquired an exquisite residence in an esteemed neighborhood, a serene sanctuary conducive to his writing. Children, Owen and Amelia, graced their lives. 5 decades of companionship ensued until Isaac's health faltered, and he peacefully departed in slumber. Their offspring had already embarked on independent lives. Bereft after her spouse's passing, Mrs. Wright was adrift, unsure how to channel her vitality. Now at 80 years of age, recent days had introduced a stark frailty, prompting a hospital visit. Unperturbed by the prospect of death, she aspired for a tranquil departure akin to her husband's slumber. Owen and Amelia visited, discovering their mother mired in despondency. "Hello, Mom. How are you feeling?" Amelia's affectionate kiss was met with a wan smile. "I'm alive, dear, and that's something," Mrs. Wright replied, her tone tinged with melancholy. Owen suggested taking her home, but she harbored doubt about finding solace there. "The truth is, Owen, I don't believe anything can rekindle my spirit. Besides, the prospect of returning to an empty home holds little allure. Human company is a bit more engaging. Sadly, your visits are rare," she lamented. Owen, exasperated, retorted that they had their own burdens and weren't as youthful as before. The suggestion of hiring a nurse hung in the air as they departed abruptly. The sense of disappointment lingered, her children hadn't extended an invitation to stay, entrusting her care to strangers. After a spell, Mrs. Wright decided on a short walk for a breath of fresh air. She traversed the quiet, desolate hallway, where a distant child's whimper reached her ears. Entering the source of the sound, she found a pallid young woman, tethered to machines, with a grief-stricken young boy at her side. The boy, perhaps 12, clung to the woman's hand, tears flowing unchecked, a battle against his own emotions that he struggled to win. Approaching the young boy with gentleness, Mrs. Wright inquired about the distressing situation. Through quivering tears, the boy shared that his mother's life was slipping away. Seating herself beside him, Mrs. Wright kindly requested the full account of their story. Jordan and his mother, Victoria, had forged a life as a tight-knit duo for as long as his memory stretched. Victoria, a hairstylist at a beauty salon, extended her services to clients at home to sustain herself and her son. Juggling multiple part-time jobs, she shouldered exhaustion. Jordan's heart brimmed with compassion for his mother, and he endeavored to alleviate her burden in every conceivable way. Excelling in academics, tending to household chores, and mastering cooking were among his many efforts. However, their world darkened when Victoria was struck by an unfortunate incident on her way home from work. A car, undetected by her fatigued eyes, crashed into her with alarming velocity. Urgently hospitalized, her life hung in the balance. Despite medical efforts, she lapsed into a coma. While there were potential solutions in other hospitals, the associated costs were exorbitant, far beyond their means. Even the queue for free treatment stretched interminably. This predicament left Jordan in profound worry for his mother's survival. Seeking solace for the boy as best as she could, Mrs. Wright then retraced her steps, pondering the inequities of life. A life marked by Victoria's relentless toil now risked leaving her son motherless. The following day, ahead of her own treatments, Mrs. Wright detoured to visit Jordan and his ailing mother. However, her path back led her to encounter a discordant scene, the heated exchange between Owen and Amelia, their voices laden with hostility and disdain. The sight took her aback, for her usually kind and composed children were enmeshed in a bitter dispute. As she eavesdropped on the conversation, Owen's voice rang out, asserting his claim to the family cottage based on traditional inheritance norms. Amelia retorted with righteous indignation, arguing that the house rightfully belonged to her due to her 3 children compared to Owen's 2. Amid the altercation, assets and arrangements were discussed, but Owen remained resolute in his pursuit of what he deemed his entitlement. With a heavy heart, Mrs. Wright recoiled from the scene, aghast at the acrimony that pervaded the room. The realization struck that her children, consumed by their feud, were preoccupied with her potential inheritance even as she breathed. This revelation contrasted starkly with their absence when she lay in the hospital, when their concern and support were noticeably absent. In that moment of clarity, Mrs. Wright recognized the stark disconnect between the familial bonds she had cherished and the bitter reality now before her. Their visits were infrequent, timed to coincide solely with the arrival of royalties from her late husband's literary works. It was during these moments that Mrs. Wright's eyes opened to the veiled truth, realizing the extent of her maternal love's blindness. With resolute steps, she entered the room, prompting Owen and Amelia into silence. Their anger vanished, replaced by a strained, feigned smile. Observing this abrupt transformation, a wry smile crept onto Mrs. Wright's face. Swiftly, she requested Owen to summon the family lawyer for the following day, tasking him with drafting her will. Owen and Amelia scrambled to dissuade their mother, insisting she had much life left to live and that it was premature to ponder a will. Unperturbed by their insincere pleas, Mrs. Wright halted their arguments, urging them to depart and return in the morning for the will's formalization. Sharing greedy glances, Owen and Amelia adjusted their mother's pillow, bestowed kisses, and exited, softly closing the ward door behind them. Mrs. Wright shook her head in reproach, bemused by the spectacle. Precisely at 10 o'clock the next morning, the lawyer briskly entered the ward, unfurling papers with purpose. Owen and Amelia, consumed by anticipation, awaited the pivotal revelation. With the lawyer poised to transcribe, Mrs. Wright smiled and commenced the reading of her will. She bequeathed $30,000 to each child. An additional $150,000 was designated for transfer to a clinic, earmarked for Jordan's mother's treatment, surgeries, and recovery. Further, the country house found its new owners in Jordan and his mother. The city apartment was to be sold, with proceeds evenly divided among her grandchildren, although they had long ceased visiting her since their maturation. Her objective, veiled in the sadness of a mother's love, was to kindle a spark of conscience. Outraged and clamorous, Owen and Amelia decried the perceived injustice, vowing to contest the will on the grounds of Mrs. Wright's supposed incapacity. The question of her right to allocate her assets was referred to the lawyer, who affirmed the legality of her actions and suggested that if her children doubted her competence, the hospital could engage authorized specialists to verify her mental acuity. Amidst simmering anger, Owen and Amelia stormed from the ward, leaving a sad but firm smile on Mrs. Wright's face. This was the conclusion of a mother's love, she mused. Thanking the lawyer, she instructed him to expedite the funds to the clinic, informing him of her prior communication with the doctor for preliminary negotiations. As the lawyer departed, Mrs. Moore entered the room alongside Jordan and his mother. Jordan was engrossed in reading to his mother, whose emergence from the coma had left her frail but still resilient. The elder woman addressed them, her voice resolute despite her age. "Listen closely. I may be old, but my strength persists. In about a week, we will journey together to a reputable clinic, providing Victoria with every requirement for her recovery. "My lawyer will oversee all arrangements." An excited gleam appeared in Jordan's eyes as he asked if it were true. Victoria, the younger woman, could only manage a whispered thank you, a faint smile gracing her lips. It had been a while since Mrs. Wright had felt so profoundly needed, yet now her heart warmed at the prospect of doing good and performing one final benevolent act before her journey's end. A span of 12 months slipped by. Within her country abode, Mrs. Wright sat, engrossed in Jordan's animated account of his scholastic achievements. Beside him sat Victoria, radiating happiness and vitality, her gaze fixed adoringly upon her son. A poignant realization settled within Mrs. Wright: the void had been filled, and she was no longer solitary. The presence of those who depended on her, who genuinely loved her, ushered in a profound contentment, a true and genuine happiness. For 5 complete years, the elderly woman reveled in the company of Victoria and Jordan. However, her own children and grandchildren remained conspicuously absent, never crossing her threshold again. When her final days arrived, they unfolded in the manner she had envisioned. Quietly, she slipped into slumber, surrounded by the soothing presence of Victoria and Jordan, who bore witness to her last breath, cherishing her memory with enduring kindness and love throughout their lives. Thus, as this tale concludes, if it has resonated with you, kindly consider subscribing and activating the notification bell. Your continued presence is deeply valued. Thank you for being an integral part of this narrative journey.